prophet's painful love. The story of Hosea and Gomer, the divine paradox, blood-red skies, painted the western horizon as Hosea stood frozen at the threshold of his own home. The parchment in his hands trembled slightly, not from the evening breeze, but from the weight of the message it carried. A message from God that defied all logic, all social norms, all reasonable expectations of a prophet's life. Go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry. The command echoed in his mind like thunder reverberating through mountains. Surely he had misunderstood. A holy man, a prophet of Yahweh, marry a prostitute. It was unthinkable, scandalous, ruinous. Yet the instruction remained, burning in his consciousness with undeniable clarity. This was no metaphor, no symbolic teaching to be delivered to others. This was to be his life. Why would God demand such a thing? The answer was as painful as it was clear. To make Hosea live out Israel's story in his own flesh, to feel what God feels when his chosen people abandon him for false gods and immoral practices. This prophet would not merely speak God's message, he would become it. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across Hosea's garden. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath, filled with the scent of evening jasmine. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself, "if this is truly your will, give me the strength to obey." The silence that followed carried neither comfort nor further instruction, only the weight of divine expectation. A kingdom in decay, the northern kingdom of Israel had never known such prosperity. Under Jeroboam II's reign, military successes had expanded borders, trade flourished, and wealth poured into the nation like never before. The streets of Samaria bustled with merchants, their carts laden with fine goods from distant lands. Magnificent homes dotted the hillsides, adorned with ivory decorations and luxurious furnishings. To casual observers, this appeared to be Israel's golden age. Yet beneath this gleaming surface festered a rot that threatened to consume the nation's soul. As wealth accumulated, so did corruption. Justice became a commodity sold to the highest bidder. The gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm. Most alarming of all, the people had drifted from their covenant with Yahweh, attributing their prosperity not to his providence, but to Baal, the Canaanite fertility god. The temple at Bethel, once dedicated to Yahweh, now hosted priests who blended worship of the true God with pagan practices. Golden calves stood where only the presence of the Almighty should have dwelled. Temple prostitutes, both men and women, offered their bodies in rituals meant to encourage Baal to make the land fertile. The people believed these unholy unions would convince the gods to bless their crops and increase their herds. Sacred became profane. Worship became debauchery. In the marketplace, vendors sold small idols alongside everyday goods. Families placed these images in home shrines, burning incense and offering sacrifices to gods who had no power to save. Children grew up watching their parents bow to carved figures, learning by example to divide their loyalties between Yahweh and the pantheon of Canaanite deities. The annual harvest festivals, once solemn occasions for thanking Yahweh for his provision, had devolved into drunken, licentious celebrations more akin to Canaanite rituals than proper worship. Wine flowed freely, inhibitions dissolved, and acts that should have remained private were performed openly in sacred groves, all in the name of ensuring future fertility. Eliezer, a respected elder who had witnessed Israel's gradual decline, often lamented to Hosea during their evening discussions. "Our forefathers would weep to see what we've become," he would say, his weathered face creased with sorrow. "We were meant to be a light to the nations, showing them the one true God. Now we've become just like them, chasing after gods of wood and stone." "The priests bear much of the blame," Hosea replied, pouring his elderly friend another cup of watered wine. "They should be teaching the law, preserving the ways of Moses. Instead, they accommodate every foreign practice, telling the people what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear." Eliezer nodded, his gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "And the king since Jeroboam might have encouraged this spiritual confusion, building competing sanctuaries, appointing priests from outside the Levites, blurring the lines between what is holy and what is common, all to secure their political power." Hosea knew this all too well. For years, he had walked the streets of Samaria and traveled throughout Israel, witnessing the spiritual adultery of his people. He had seen the altars on high places where incense burned to foreign deities. He had heard the drunken revelry of festivals dedicated to gods who were no gods at all. He had watched as his countrymen pursued wealth and pleasure with reckless abandon, forsaking the covenant that had defined them since Mount Sinai. Now, as Hosea contemplated God's bewildering command, the parallel became painfully clear. Israel had played the harlot, turning from her divine husband to lovers who could not satisfy. And Hosea was being called to marry a woman who would do the same to him, a living parable of God's heartbreak. The bride of betrayal, the marketplace hummed with activity as Hosea made his way through the crowded stalls. Merchants called out their wares, haggling customers argued prices, and children darted between legs, chasing each other in impromptu games. But Hosea noticed none of this. His attention was fixed on a woman standing near the well, laughing with a group of men who clearly knew her profession. Gomer was not what he had expected. There was a vibrancy about her, an undeniable charm that drew people in. Her laughter rang out like music, and her eyes, though shadowed with experiences Hosea could only imagine, sparkled with life. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than physical beauty that made men desire her company. She possessed a quality that made each person feel uniquely seen, valued, desired. When Hosea approached her, the other men dispersed, recognizing the distinctive garments of a prophet. Gomer's smile faltered, replaced by a wary expression. "A prophet seeking my services. This is unusual, even in these corrupt times," she said, her voice carrying both challenge and curiosity. "I'm not here for what you think," Hosea replied quietly. "I've come with a proposal of marriage." Gomer's laughter erupted again, but this time with disbelief rather than joy. "Is this some kind of joke, or perhaps a scheme to reform me? Either way, you're wasting your time, prophet." "It's neither," Hosea said, his steady gaze never leaving her face. "This is God's will." The disbelief in her eyes gradually shifted to something else. Calculation, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope. Gomer had known many men, but none had ever approached her with an offer of legitimacy, of belonging, of a future beyond the transactional relationships that defined her life. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice softer now, stripped of its defensive edge. There must be dozens of respectable women who would make a proper wife for a prophet. Hosea could have explained the divine command, the symbolic message their marriage would convey. Instead, he simply said, "Because you are the one God has chosen." In the days that followed, Hosea learned fragments of Gomer's story, a childhood marred by poverty, a father who drank away what little they had, a mother who disappeared one night, never to return. At 16, with no family to protect her and no skills to earn a living, she had turned to the one commodity she possessed, her body. "I never wanted this life," she confessed one evening as they sat beneath the stars in Hosea's modest garden. "But after a while you become what people believe you are, and they never believe you can be anything else." Their courtship was brief and bewildering to those who witnessed it. Naomi, Hosea's cousin, confronted him in private, her concern evident in every line of her face. "Have you lost your mind? A prophet marrying a prostitute. What will people say? What will they think of your message?" "I'm not concerned with their judgment," Hosea answered, though the pain of social rejection was already taking its toll. "I'm concerned with obedience, but surely God would not ask this of you." "Perhaps you misunderstood." "I did not misunderstand," Hosea interrupted firmly. "This marriage is itself a message, a living prophecy to Israel. The wedding was a small, somber affair. Few came to celebrate the union, and those who did watched with curious, often judgmental eyes. Yet as Hosea placed the marriage bracelet on Gomer's wrist, he felt a surprising surge of hope. Perhaps this was not merely about demonstrating Israel's unfaithfulness. Perhaps it was also about demonstrating the possibility of redemption, of love that persists despite betrayal. For a time it seemed this hope might be realized. Gomer settled into the life of a prophet's wife with unexpected ease. She kept their home with care, prepared meals with growing skill, and even accompanied Hosea occasionally when he delivered God's messages to the people. When she became pregnant with their first child, joy brightened their home. Hosea dared to believe that the painful illustration God had commanded might transform into a testimony of restoration. Then came the divine instruction that shattered this fragile peace. "Call him Jezreel," God told Hosea when his son was born. "For in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel." The name was a proclamation of coming judgment, a reminder of a bloody history and a warning of future destruction. Jezreel, the valley where Jehu had slaughtered the descendants of Ahab, an act God had initially commanded, but which had since become emblematic of Israel's violent, blood-soaked history. Each time Hosea called his son's name, it served as a reminder of his nation's impending doom. Gomer grew distant after Jezreel's birth. The joy that had briefly illuminated their home dimmed, and Hosea often found her gazing toward the city, toward her former life. She began to adorn herself as she had in her previous profession, applying kohl around her eyes, wearing scented oils, draping herself in the colorful garments she had set aside when they married. When she became pregnant again, Hosea sensed that something had changed. Their moments of intimacy had grown rare, their conversations increasingly strained. A shadow of doubt crossed his mind. Was this child truly his? But he pushed the thought away, refusing to give voice to suspicions that would only deepen the growing rift between them. God's message regarding their daughter confirmed his fears. "Call her Lo Ruhamah," which means not loved, "for I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them." The name hung like a shadow over the child, a perpetual reminder of divine rejection. And though Hosea continued to love his daughter fiercely, the strain between him and Gomer grew more pronounced. She spent more time away from home, offering vague explanations about visiting friends or shopping in the marketplace. Hosea knew, with the painful clarity that comes from facing what one has long suspected, that she was returning to her old ways. By the time their third child was born, Hosea knew in his heart what God would say. "Call him Lo Ami," which means "not my people," for you are not my people, and I am not your God. The final name cut deepest of all, severing the covenant relationship that had defined Israel since Abraham. It also raised an unspoken question that haunted Hosea's days and nights. Was this child even his own? Child? The wages of unfaithfulness, the empty house, echoed with absence. Gomer was gone, returned to her former life, leaving Hosea alone with their 3 children. Children whose very names spoke of judgment, rejection, and abandonment. The prophet moved through his days like a man walking underwater, performing his duties, caring for his children, delivering God's messages to an unheeding people. But inside, grief carved hollow spaces where joy had once resided. The children asked for their mother daily at first, their innocent questions landing like blows. "When is mother coming home?" little Jezreel would ask, his eyes wide with confusion. "Does she not love us anymore?" Lo Ruhamah would wonder, the irony of her name not yet clear to her young mind. Hosea found himself crafting gentle half-truths, unable to burden them with the full weight of their mother's choices, or the prophetic significance of their own existence. In the marketplace, he heard whispers. People spoke of seeing Gomer with various men, wealthy traders and influential officials who could give her luxuries Hosea never could. She wore fine linen now, adorned herself with silver and gold, drank wine from painted cups imported from distant lands. Each rumor was a fresh wound, yet each also deepened his understanding of God's anguish over Israel. "You have become like a man who has lost his wife to another," Hosea declared in the town square, his voice carrying a new authority born of personal suffering. "You know the pain of betrayal, the hollow ache of abandoned vows. This is what you have done to your God, who brought you out of Egypt, who has loved you with an everlasting love." Some mocked him, pointing to his own failed marriage as evidence that he had no right to speak for God. Others listened with newfound respect, recognizing that Hosea was not merely relaying divine messages, but embodying them in his broken life. Micah, a fellow prophet who had become Hosea's friend and confidant in these dark days, sat with him one evening as Hosea struggled with the dual weight of personal and prophetic pain. "How can he still love us?" Hosea asked, his voice rough with emotion. "After all our betrayals, all our spiritual adultery, how does God not simply abandon Israel to our fate?" "Perhaps that is precisely what your life is meant to reveal," Micah suggested gently. "Not just the pain of betrayal, but the persistence of love that defies betrayal." Months passed, seasons changed. Hosea continued his prophetic ministry, his message taking on new dimensions of authority as people witnessed his personal suffering. Many still rejected his warnings, clinging to prosperity as evidence of divine favor. But others began to listen, recognizing in Hosea's broken heart a reflection of God's own grief over his wayward people. Then came word of Gomer, news that struck Hosea like a physical blow. Her fortunes had changed dramatically. The wealthy patrons who had once showered her with gifts had moved on to newer, younger women. Age and hard living had diminished her once celebrated beauty. Debts accumulated, creditors grew impatient, and finally, she had fallen so low that she was to be sold at the slave market, her body a commodity to be purchased like cattle or grain. That night, Hosea wrestled with God in prayer. "Haven't I endured enough? Haven't I demonstrated your message clearly? Must I drink this cup to its dregs?" The divine response came not in thunder or earthquake, but in the quiet certainty that filled his heart. "Go again. Love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress. even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods. The price of redemption, the slave market, reeked of unwashed bodies, fear and despair. Men and women stood on crude wooden platforms, stripped of dignity as well as possessions, their worth reduced to how much labor could be extracted from them or what pleasure they might provide. Merchants and landowners moved through the crowd, inspecting human merchandise with clinical detachment. A muscular young man was prodded and examined, his teeth checked like those of a horse. A mother and child were separated despite their desperate pleas, sold to different masters who had no use for both. The casual cruelty of the scene turned Hosea's stomach, yet he pressed forward, scanning the faces for the one he sought. Hosea moved through the crowd, his prophet's garments drawing curious glances. When he reached the auction block where Gomer stood, he barely recognized her. Gone was the vibrant woman who had laughed by the well. In her place stood someone hollow-eyed and haggard, her spirit seemingly broken by whatever path had led her here. Her once lustrous hair hung limp and dull. Her skin, previously tended with expensive oils, was now weathered and sallow. When her eyes met his, something flashed across her face. Shame, perhaps, or a flicker of the person she had once been. Then her gaze dropped, unable to bear the weight of their shared history. The bidding began. Hosea raised his hand, offering 15 shekels of silver. Others bid as well, seeing potential use for even this worn-out woman. Hosea added a homer and a half of barley to his offer. The auctioneer looked bemused at this odd combination of currency and grain, but when no higher bids came, he pronounced Gomer sold to the prophet. 15 shekels was no small sum for a prophet who lived modestly, dependent on the generosity of those who valued his ministry. The barley represented a significant portion of his household's food stores for the coming months. This redemption came at great personal cost, a fact not lost on those who witnessed the transaction. Word would spread through the community. Hosea the prophet had purchased his adulterous wife from slavery, paying a steep price to restore her to his home. As Hosea led her from the market, neither spoke. Words seemed inadequate to bridge the chasm between them. It was only when they reached the outskirts of the city that Hosea finally broke the silence. "You will live with me again," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "For many days you shall remain with me. You shall not play the harlot or belong to another man, so will I also be to you." Gomer looked at him in confusion. "Why would you do this? After everything, why?" Hosea's answer was simple, devastating in its clarity. "Because this is what God does for Israel. Though you have loved many lovers, God told me, go, love her." The journey home was long, marked by silence, and the careful distance between two people finding their way back from profound betrayal. The children, Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, and Lo-Ami, greeted their mother with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. They had grown during her absence, changed in ways both visible and invisible. Restoration did not come easily or quickly. Trust, once shattered, could not be instantly rebuilt. There were days when the weight of the past threatened to crush their fragile new beginning. Nights when Hosea lay awake, wondering if Gomer would still be there in the morning. Moments when resentment rose in his throat like bile, tempting him to remind her of all she had thrown away, all the pain she had caused. Yet alongside these struggles came glimpses of healing. Gomer's genuine efforts to reconnect with her children, her quiet diligence in contributing to the household, rare moments of vulnerable conversation when the carefully maintained walls between them briefly lowered. And through it all, Hosea's prophetic understanding deepened. His message to Israel took on new dimensions as he experienced firsthand the complex interplay of justice and mercy of righteous anger and persistent love. What had begun as a divine object lesson became a profound spiritual journey, not just for those who heard his words, but for Hosea himself. The meaning behind the marriage as word of Hosea's redemption of Gomer spread. His prophetic message took on new power. No longer was he merely speaking about God's relationship with Israel. He was living it, embodying both the divine heartbreak and the divine determination to restore. In the town square, surrounded by a crowd larger than any he had previously drawn, Hosea delivered the message God had placed in his heart. For a long time, Israel will live without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. The prophecy contained both warning and promise. Exile would come, stripping Israel of political and religious systems. But beyond the judgment lay the possibility of return, of seeking and finding God once more. I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, Hosea continued, his voice ringing with conviction, for my anger has turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily. Like a cedar of Lebanon he will send down his roots. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree, his fragrance like a cedar of Lebanon. As he spoke, Hosea felt Gomer's presence at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had become more than husband and wife. They had become a living testimony to both the consequences of unfaithfulness and the possibility of redemption. Later, as they walked home together, Gomer asked the question that had long lingered between them. Do you regret obeying? Would it have been easier to marry someone else, someone who would not have caused you such pain? Hosea considered this, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and gold. Easier, yes, he admitted. But would I have understood God's heart as I do now? Would I have truly grasped what it means when he says, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness. And you will acknowledge the Lord? He turned to face her fully. This was never just about illustrating Israel's unfaithfulness. It was about demonstrating the lengths to which God will go to restore a relationship. It was about showing that love, true love, persists beyond betrayal. As they reached their home, where their children waited, Hosea added quietly, and it was about hope, hope that what has been broken can be mended, that what has been lost can be found again. The legacy of a living parable, the judgment Hosea had prophesied, came to pass. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, scattering its people among the nations. The political entity that had stood since the days of Jeroboam vanished from history, never to be restored in its original form. Survivors fleeing south brought tales of unimaginable brutality. Assyrian soldiers had impaled captives on stakes outside city walls, flayed leaders alive, and forced families to watch as their loved ones were tortured. Those who weren't killed were led away in chains, forced to march hundreds of miles to foreign lands where they would be resettled, their cultural and religious identity deliberately diluted through intermarriage with other conquered people. The 10 northern tribes largely disappeared from history, assimilated into the populations among whom they were scattered. This lost Israel became a permanent reminder of the consequences of covenant unfaithfulness. Yet, the message embodied in Hosea's painful marriage survived, preserved in the words he had written and the testimonies of those who had witnessed his living parable. His prophecies traveled south to Judah, where they were kept and studied. becoming part of the sacred texts that would guide God's people through centuries of triumph and tragedy. The southern kingdom of Judah would experience its own exile in Babylon some 136 years later. During those dark days of displacement, the writings of Hosea offered both explanation and hope, explaining why God had allowed such suffering while promising that exile was not the end of the story. The same God who disciplined would also restore. More than 700 years after Hosea purchased Gomer from the slave market, another prophet arose who would speak of God's love with similar passion. Jesus of Nazareth would tell parables of lost sheep sought by determined shepherds, of prodigal sons welcomed home by waiting fathers. He would extend forgiveness to the outcast and marginalized, demonstrating in his life and teaching the same divine commitment to restoration that Hosea had embodied. And when religious leaders questioned Jesus about his associations with tax collectors and sinners, he pointed them back to the message at the heart of Hosea's prophecy. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The painful love story of Hosea and Gomer continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that at the core of God's relationship with humanity lies not just judgment for unfaithfulness, but a persistent, pursuing love that offers the possibility of return and renewal. 3 lessons from Hosea's life. First, authentic love is not merely emotional but volitional, a choice made and remade in the face of disappointment and betrayal. Hosea's love for Gomer reflected God's love for Israel, not contingent on worthiness, but offered despite unworthiness. In a culture that often reduces love to feeling, Hosea reminds us that true love is action, commitment, and sacrifice, especially when feelings falter. Second, our unfaithfulness does not negate God's faithfulness. The names of Hosea's children told a story of judgment, but not the end of the story. Beyond not loved, and not my people lay the promise, you are my people, and you are loved. Our failures, no matter how grievous, do not have the final word when placed in the context of God's redemptive purposes. Third, redemption often comes at great cost to the Redeemer. Hosea paid 15 shekels of silver and grain to purchase Gomer's freedom, a significant sum for a prophet of modest means. This foreshadowed the far greater price God would pay through Christ to redeem humanity from spiritual slavery. Freedom is never free. Someone always bears the cost of liberation. 3 questions to consider if God used Hosea's marriage to illustrate his relationship with Israel. What areas of your life might God be using to teach you about his character and ways? Consider your work, relationships, challenges, and even failures as potential instruments of divine instruction. Hosea obeyed a divine command that cost him dearly in terms of reputation, emotional well-being, and financial security. What might obedience to God be costing you? And how does Hosea's example challenge or encourage you? Where might God be calling you to a costly obedience that demonstrates his character to others? Gomer experienced both the consequences of her choices and the grace of redemption. Where in your life have you seen this same pattern? Reaping what you've sown, yet also receiving undeserved mercy. How has this shaped your understanding of both divine justice and divine love? An invitation to deeper understanding. The story of Hosea and Gomer challenges our understanding of love, faithfulness, and the depths to which God will go to restore relationship with his people. It invites us to see our own stories, including our failures and betrayals, in light of this divine perspective. How has this account of Hosea's painful love changed your understanding of God's love for you? What new insights have you gained about the nature of covenant relationship and the possibility of redemption beyond betrayal. We invite you to join the conversation in the comments below, sharing how this ancient prophet's extraordinarily difficult calling speaks to your life today. Your perspective might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear. And if you found value in today's exploration of this remarkable biblical narrative, please consider subscribing to our Deep Bible Stories channel. Each week, we delve into another powerful account from Scripture, uncovering the timeless truths that continue to transform lives today. Thank you for journeying with us through this profound story of pain, faithfulness, and redemption. Until next time, may you know the depth of love that pursues you beyond all reasonable expectation, the love that Hosea's life so powerfully portrays.